Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Darkness Ablaze, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using the code OmniPoke. For today's video, I am going over my top 10 decks for the Pog2020 Championships. Really interesting format, the only chance where we will be able to play with these Darkness Ablaze cards, as well as the cards from Ultra Prism and forwards. So pretty high power level stuff, really. A ton of sets. Could have potentially even been our world set as well. So there would have been people who were already preparing for this sort of event. So really cool that we actually get to see some of these combos in action. Going to be going over my top 10. A lot of this is theory because I have been doing a lot of testing for post-rotation. So I've had a handful of games with the best stuff. Some of it is going to be theory, so feel free to give me your own top 10 in the description below. I've tried to do some good baseline lists, but there are plenty of tech cards that could be used as well. So let's jump into the top 10. First of all, with a new challenger in Decidueye. Decidueye, of course, has the build around in its own ability, Deep Forest Camo, preventing damage done to it by V, GX, and V Max as well. The V encompasses both, for anyone asking. And really, that's the basis. It's basically a new version of Obstagoon. This time it's in the ability, which is far better for you than it being on the attack, because Obstruct could get countered a lot easier than just this Deep Forest Camo that's inherently there all the time, which is very, very cool. I do think there are some glaring weaknesses of this card. Obviously, you don't really put up any fight against the controlling archetypes. You don't really do enough damage to pressurize their Orangaroos, their Cincinnos, anything really. So that's not very good. Obviously, they can run you out of energies with hammers as well relatively easily. You're a 2-energy attacking deck with no acceleration, so that can become very sad for you. I also think the natural include of Volcanion in Welded X, as well as Blacephalon in Baby Blounds as its own archetype, will pretty much serve as more than enough pressure to get through the Decidueye deck, and you have no tanking option against them at all. You basically don't have an ability, and then you're just playing a slow stage 2 that can't even knock out these other 1 prizes. So you are basically scooping immediately to Baby Blounds. You can survive against Volcanion. It really does depend on how many Baby Volks are being played in these fire decks, and if people are using Ninetales as an attacking option as well. If those things all happen, it's going to be pretty rough for Decidueye, I'll be honest. But otherwise, if they're only playing like 2 copies in their Centiskorch list and no Ninetales, you can definitely actually win that fight with the weak guard energies and stuff that we're playing in here. So something to bear in mind. The other thing I would mention is that Zacian, be it Luke Metal or ADP, can include 1 copy of Duraludon, and that is probably sometimes able to 1v1 the entire Decidueye deck. Obviously, the ADP list is able to just get through Decidueye. It can hit that base 140 with the buff of Ultra Creation. And if it's the Luke Metal deck, they are reducing potentially 60 of the 90 damage that Decidueye does to it. And it's naturally playing a bunch of Scoop Up Nets and Malolanas as well. So you basically do get soloed by Duraludon if these sort of Zacian decks are going to commit the space towards it. That said, it's not the highest priority in the format right now, so a lot of people may not be adding in the answer to Decidueye. And if that's the case, Decidueye is going to have a decent spread of matchups, to be honest. I've tried to simplify the list as much as possible. As you can see, I've got a very high Dartrix count, as well as 3 Turffield Stadiums. That's really just over-respecting the Vikavolt matchup, because Vikavolt typically doesn't play many attackers to get through Decidueye. The way it's going to try and beat you, however, is just by using Electro Power and just Paralyzing Bolt to get through your early game Jirachis, get through your Rowlets, get through your Dartrix even with those E-powers, and hopefully they're just hoping to outvalue you and out-resource you in the early turns when you don't really have much going for you. That's why you're seeing a couple copies of Rosa in here to try and just help continue to get Pokemon out. That's why we've got the high Dartrix and Turffield Stadium count, just to make sure that we are going to have a decent chance against the Vikavolt players. I've also got that Ditto Prism. Obviously, it can only evolve into the Dartrixes, but it gives you an extra Rowlet in the early turns. So, you know, you're a bit safer against Boss's orders, just knocking out those Rowlets. And you have a bit more time against Vikavolt as well to actually try and build up a big bird. So that's really the plan, and then really from there you only have to beat a Tapu Koko Prism Star, and you should be good for the most part. We've got that big charm in here to try and help out against the Duraludon, but trust me, it's not going to be easy, especially if ADP is playing a Tag Call package with Malolana. That's still going to get rough because they have a natural resistance of 30. And we do have those weak guards in to try and improve those Baby Volk situations. So something to bear in mind. Otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward list. I'm playing just one copy of Boss's Orders and one copy of Sinlin. Again, I'm saying that, you know what, you have Wind Pebbles, you have sniping already from the Decidueye split arrow attack. So possibly only one boss will see you through. Sinlin helping you to just continue draw cards throughout the entire game. So yeah, very basic stuff. Other than that, we gain netballs obviously in this format, which we don't have post-rotation. But for the most part, it's pretty much the exact same list. Other options, you can go towards Inteleon and have some unit energies in here, the grass, fire, water unit energies. So you can have an attacking option against potentially Baby Blounds or against Volcanion. That's very reasonable, but I think those matchups are already awkward anyway. You'd have to not only add in the Inteleon line, but also add in like a second copy of Countergain, and you're hoping to play from behind for the majority of the time, and then let your spread damage from the Inteleon and Decidueye help you get over the line later on against their Jirachis and stuff like that. But it's still a little bit awkward because Blacephalon will still get out the gate faster than you for the most part, so I don't necessarily think you will win the matchup even with Inteleon in here. Fion could be good for some additional gusting, like I said, just one boss right now. Galarian Zigzagoon to make more out of your split arrows. Flapple, again, trying to make more out of those split arrow damage options. Lurantis could give you a bit more tanking, similar to the Big Charm, but a bit more permanent, which could be a lot better against Duraludon. That said, it can be gusted, of course, for 2 prizes if you're up against the ADP list. Grovyle could help get more Decidueye in play, especially under item lock, which could be cool. Buzzmosa GX could help you out against some of these 1-prize sort of options as a late game thing to sort of catch yourself back up with the GX attack, which could be cool. Marnie for some hand disruption, and Struggle Gloves, again, an option that you could have for those fire decks. No, it doesn't work in combination with Weak Guard, but it can still be a way that you can at least one-shot a Baby Volk or a Blacephalon to actually try and like tempo out on them, which is really the hope. I think if you were playing Struggle Gloves, I'd want to also play Marnie, so then you have that opportunity for them to whiff a Welder, which could get you your real into the game, really, I would say. Not much else to be said about the list. Quite basic, trying to just lean into the ability and hope that carries you through matchups, to be honest. In at number 9, we have Dragapult. The community are completely off Dragapult. I think, you know, the deck that was the second best performer of the previous format probably won't fall completely off a cliff, but I will admit, Eternatus is not a matchup that you want to see, nor is the Centiskorch matchup, so I agree, Dragapult is getting a lot worse. That said, it was the second best successful deck in the last format, so I'm still keeping it in my top 10. I still believe there's still a lot of inherent goodness about Dragapult VMAX. It's still a very easy to set up stage 1 with great bench control, and I think that's actually really important for the control matchups. I think Dragapult has been one of the best things keeping control at bay all this time, being able to sprinkle damage on their Mareeps for easy knockouts, on their Cinccino's and Magcargos, all that sort of stuff, not being too concerned about Lily's Pokédoll, and just the easy nature of this Dragapult being set up means that even against energy removal, you're at least being able to shred on a single attachment. So there's so much I like about Dragapult, especially against control. I also think, again, as long as you can use your Mysterious Treasures pre-item lock, you can set up a VMAX and you're at least swinging into the Vikavolts. You're also doing good spread damage to, put pressure on their bench Vikavolts or onto their Dedennes. So I think some real nice scalps that you can potentially be taking with Dragapult. So although you are dodgy against one of the big contenders of the format, I do still believe that Dragapult could see play in this tournament. I have added in Yveltal GX. It's kind of been this sort of meme thing that never really kicked off in our previous format, but with more and more VMAXs, you just have to accept that Dragapult's damage output is pretty shoddy against them. So having this Yveltal GX in here with a bit more goon priority is going to be the way to go. So you can try and take an easy kill, in potentially like the late game to finish off your last 3 prizes, or just early on and sort of deal with their VMAX, get rid of all their energy in play, be it Centiskorch or their Eternatus, and then hope after that sort of moment you can try and take easy gust prizes on Crobats or their 1-prize stuff, that sort of thing with Dragapult. So it gives you an out to some of these really, really tanky Pokemon, and it's still good in Mirror as well, and against other high hit point stuff, even against ADP, for example. So yeah, the Yveltal GX, previously a meme, now we're trying to make it a dream in this list. One thing that I've been very close to adding in the list is actually Piers to make the combo happen more often. You have more accessibility to your Aurora energy. it also just happens to help you get horror energies out the deck as well. So Piers was something I was very close to putting in the list, but I was just sticking to the gold standard of a high money and research count. But I would implore you to attempt Piers in here as well. If you are adding in Piers, I would definitely think about adding in Crobat V, because then we have a nice little sort of dark package working on in this list. I know a lot of people had cut away from Dedenne GX towards the latter stages of this format, especially because it helps your PikaRom matchup by just not having that liability in play. Can't be great catchered either against ADP sort of decks. So I could definitely see a reason to shift towards Crobat. Again, if you're playing that Piers package, you can go ahead and grab that Yveltal much easier. You can grab your Zigzagoons a lot quicker as well in the game. You can see I'm playing double Zigzagoon and the Giratina Distortion Door, so alongside those 4 scoop up nets, hopefully it's a good amount for you to actually get towards that Doom Count GX attack. It is a lot of commitment. There is healing in the format, so there'll be times where it doesn't come off, but I think it's still just such an important out to be able to have against those big VMAXs. So potentially a bit gimmicky. And you do have to play a lot more carefully with your horror energy placement if you are trying to set up this Yveltal. So a few words of warning here, but you can at least, sometimes they just take a hit from horror energy and suddenly you're going like Goon, Scoop Up Net, Goon, Yveltal, Smack, and suddenly they're, in a lot worse situations. So that also could certainly be a thing. Overall, I'm not really teching for Eternatus at all. There's the option to play hammers. There's the option to play your own giant bombs. Personally, I don't think giant bombs is enough damage for you to recoup against the Eternatus, because 340 is still just way out of your range, even after the giant bomb. Hammers could be reasonable. They're still pretty good against ADP. They've been successful in the past. I could definitely see you trying to work those in as well. So I think those are my sort of key tips. Obviously, we have a new Mimikyu as well that can get around Malolana. Malolana seems to be an important card in this format. Vikavolt will be playing Tag Call Package because of how good Guzhala is. Also, I imagine things like PikaRom still will be. ADP could easily still be playing Malolana as well. I think just the amount of Vikavolt that people are expecting means that Malolana and Birdkeeper will be coming into all sorts of decks. I think specifically the Malolana being a problem for Dragapult. That could also be a bit of a headache. So things to bear in mind for sure. I don't think Dragapult will see a huge amount of play, but I didn't want to just write it off immediately out of the top 10 because it still does have some matchups in its favor that could be popping up in high numbers. I think the Vikavolt deck and I think Control will be some of the most played decks. They're high up on my tier list at least, and being at least close against those, sometimes favored, is still a really nice bragging right that Dragapult does have. In at number 8, we have Centiskorch, new VMAX from this set, obviously doing a huge chunk of damage with that GMAX Centinferno. The community rated it even higher than I did. I do like that you basically can just play quite a streamlined list. You'll see as well in the 60 that there's not too much funky stuff going on in this deck at all, particularly. It's just trying to hit your welders, do your flare starters, make a big Centiskorch, and just start churning through people. Also having that option to Heatran GX through some potential other VMAXs, especially the Eternatus. Definitely going to be a big deal. So I do like that you have inherent answers to Zamazentas and Decidueyes. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And you can just try and, weld your way to victory. I do think, obviously, you don't really have enough good one-prize attackers against the Blacephalon matchup. Volcanion falls a bit short of the damage output, which is a shame, which is your only real one-prize option that we have in here. I also think you can be sort of out-damaged by Eternatus decks. Vikavolt as well, especially if they are playing like more control-y pieces. It's going to make life difficult for Centiskorch. Not necessarily energy removal, but potentially some status condition stuff could be a problem for the Centiskorch deck. And obviously they have a lot of push potential as well. They're stopping you, just building. And when your only real draw is through the form of Welder, you're only getting 3 cards. You can brick a lot more, basically, is what I'm trying to say against the Vikavolt players when they are incorporating that item lock. Centiskorch is normally quite reliant on being able to, quick ball out to Dennes and poker gear towards welders, all those sorts of things. So that could also be a little bit awkward. I've said Control is an awkward matchup as well. If you are adding in the Ninetales line, I think that matchup can be significantly stronger. So potentially making some cuts from the 60 I'm about to show you is worthwhile in order to improve your Control matchup. If you are adding in Ninetales to the 60, you pretty much have to accompany it with Fire Crystals. At the moment, I'm playing none of those. We're just trying to have the raw 14 energy count, including 1 Heat Fire energy, to see yourself over the line. And we're just saying that, our only real means of recouping energy is through our own attack, Centinferno. So, yeah, really, really streamlined list. Really similar to the post-rotation list that I've been testing a lot. As I said, I've tested more post-rotation than Pog format. So that's kind of why the intention is very, very similar to that previous list. The only real changes are I have added in 1 Heat Fire Energy because I think there's more potential for Yveltal, or sorry, for Eternatus to pop off with Zigzagoons, and I found in my testing that sometimes that 1 Heat Fire Energy just puts you out of range from any of those shenanigans sort of plays, so added in 1 for now, seeing how it goes. We've got the Heat Factory available for extra draw, which is pretty nice. Also has some mini synergy of discarding energy in the early turns, which is also kind of good for Centiskorch for extra acceleration options. Malolana also comes into the deck because I believe Vikavolt will be a much greater factor in this format than it will be in post-rotation. The only other difference really is that you gain a skateboard as well, which is pretty cool. I'm actually quite happy with this list. I think you could add in some more one prize options if you are trying to take on the Baby Blown. You can try and work in Giant Bombs if you're expecting more Eternatus in this format as well. So all things to bear in mind. Overall, a pretty standard shell of Centiskorch. Ninetales would probably be my biggest consideration because I'm expecting Mill to be big. If you are playing Ninetales, you probably need to cut that Heat Fire Energy. It's probably just not worth it. And you need to make spaces for the probably 2 to 3 Fire Crystal, I would say, as well. So it's a lot of spaces that it could eat up. Maybe even just going to a 1-1 line of Ninetales and keeping Boss's Orders is reasonable, just to be almost like an answer to the control decks. That's also something I've thought about for sure. In at number 7 for me is going to be PikaRom. PikaRom was the most successful deck in the Rebel Clash meta, and the community have still kept it within their top 10, and I agree with them for the most part. I do think that Centiskorch and Eternatus do become real threats against you. They just have very, very high damage output and even higher hit points, so PikaRom really needs to be drawing pretty well. Not being able to dump any of their electro powers carelessly is always a hurdle, because sometimes in the early turns you're having to research, you're having to dene just to try and get towards that full blitz early. So I do think that will be an inherent disadvantage for PikaRom against those matchups. So trying to recoup some of that damage is something that I've tried to do in my new 60. I do think, though, that inherently you do gain that Vikavolt, and I think that's something that PikaRom really has been yearning for in this format, because you just do not have a good Blacephalon matchup, and also trying to patch up the control matchup as well is also very cool. You deny Lily's Pokédoll, you deny Crushing Hammers, you deny Power Pads and all that sort of stuff, make life a lot more difficult for control. I actually think the control matchup wasn't the worst for PikaRom once Boltons got into the list. I think it actually got a lot better than it previously was. But the Vikavolt surely will help even more against those sorts of matchups, so something to bear in mind. I think right now the list I'm playing has no real outs to Decidueye, which is a bit of a headache. And otherwise, I think PikaRom is actually still pretty okay. Still one of the most consistent decks in the format, and Full Blitz turn 1 is still very good against a lot of things. So, and what I also like is, as soon as you hit that Full Blitz, the item lock doesn't really matter, because you're still just operating on, you know, free retreat with Zera Aura, and you've probably got 6 energy in play, or 5 energy in play, plus a mountain that Vikavolt is already wanting to use anyway, so they won't bounce the stadium very much. So it should be relatively straightforward to keep up with Vikavolt, even though they are item locking you for a decent number of turns, especially because you can weave in your own Vikavolt on certain turns as well. So I think that matchup is actually pretty okay, potentially even favored for you, depending on how item heavy you go. Here's my list, though. I've made literally only a couple of changes from previously pretty successful builds of PikaRom. As you can see, I've added in that 1 copy of Vikavolt V, really trying to be a saving grace against some of these one prize matchups, which is going to be really good. And I've added in a giant bomb towards the Guzmahala package that I'm playing. Now, I am playing quite a thin tackle package, but you could thicken this out even more if you want to. You could completely cut the Volkners if you want to, or just cut the researches. I've seen some builds that play no research and just go to Dene based, and you have that higher tackle package. Because I believe that Giant Bomb is going to, fingers crossed, be your saving grace against the Centiskorches and the Eternatus of the world. The Giant Bomb doing 100 damage onto the Eternatus puts it into a range of 240, which means double E-power Tag Bolt, or just a Lightning Ride GX with full value is going to do the trick, which is pretty reasonable. It helps you reach quite nicely, especially if you're using the Raichu. You're then moving to the bench, forcing them to find Gust and a bunch of Pokemon to be able to get through the Raichu, which is, you know, full bench and Gust isn't really the easiest, especially when this deck has really good access to reset stamps. So I'm hoping the Giant Bomb makes the Eternatus matchup at least reasonable. Let me know if I've gone completely mad adding Giant Bomb into this deck. It's actually a feature that I've got in a few other lists as well. Giant Bomb features kind of a silly amount in this top 10, to be honest, but it's one of the ways that I've found that tag team decks can actually recoup some damage against these huge new VMAXs. So that's something I'm trying out If you're not a fan of the Giant Bomb, by all means, make your cuts, add other stuff. Tapu Fini can obviously help out against Baby Blounds. Crobat could be extra push potential alongside your Quick Balls, which could be pretty cool. And there's also the options if you're not happy with the support accounts, if you aren't a personal fan of Volkner, Marnie can certainly help out against that Baby Blound matchup once again, especially if you are playing Vikavolt now. Marnie plus Vikavolt can be backbreaking for them, so I think that could be very, very decent. Obviously, we still have Stamps, of course. And then there's some other players. I know Wondrous Labyrinth has been doing well in some of the Sunday Opens in PikaRom lists. I think that can definitely help out against ADP and Zacian matchups. So if you are expecting those to continue to be prevalent, you could try adding in that Labyrinth, which could be pretty decent as well. In at number 6, I have Zacian list. These are going to be the non-ADP based builds. So that's going to be Turbo Zacian as well as Luke Metal Zacian. Most people are still putting Turbo Zacian safely within that top 10. I still kind of agree. I think Zamazenta becomes an excellent include into these decks. It was kind of seeing a little bit of play here and there to help out against Dragapult when it was at its peak. And I think there's just even more reason to add in Zamazenta as a one-of now that Eternatus can be walled by it quite hard, which is very, very cool. I also think that Mawile GX is excellent for also punishing Eternatus players because they go wide on their board so often, especially with a bunch of easy Crobats that you can gust up with Mawile for just 2 energy. It puts a lot less pressure on hitting your Sources and hitting your Intrepid Swords in the early game. So this Mawile has been a card I've played in previous renditions of Zacian, at least ADP-Zacian in the past, and I feel like it could get a lot of value once again in the Pog format if Eternatus is played enough. I really do like having the option of Intrepid Sword when you're facing item lock decks, because even if you're doing nothing, you're at least drawing towards your outs, be it Malolanas, Bird Keepers, or whatever else, even just sitting in the active so that you can Brave Blade again and reset your own ability, or reset your own Brave Blade could be very decent as well. So I think that's still very fine. You're at least doing something against item lock. You're not just straight up passing into them, which is pretty decent. And I think Luke Metal Hammers could also have a place here as well. If Eternatus lists are going straight and not playing Energy Recursion via Darkrai Prism style Weavile combos, Hammers and Luke Metal are going to be really, really ugly for them to deal with. I also think tanking is pretty good against a few other decks. Obviously, we've seen that it's pretty strong against regular ADP, as well as the Turbo build has really pushed ADP into a bit of a spot where it has to kind of high roll their GX attack early, otherwise they lose. So I think the Luke Metal could be very decent. I think both these lists obviously suffer against the fire decks for the most part. And I think as well, when you aren't playing ADP, the control matchup does get a lot worse, even though you have access to a lot of boss's orders. And even with Jirachi Prism Star potentially getting you an extra prize here and there, oftentimes it's not enough for you to beat out those control matchups. I think it's mildly unfavored, seriously unfavored if you are playing the Luke Metal list though. We'll start with the Turbo Zacian. Again, not too different from previous renditions that you've seen. I've got the Hooper that was often in here to help out against the Dragapult matchup, as I think that's less important. We've added in that Zamazenta. We've got a couple Bird Keepers in here as well to continue drawing cards, as well as helping out reset that Brave Blade once you are under item lock. If you are thinking that Dragapult will be more important of a matchup, you could also think about changing these for Malolanas if you wish as well, if you're expecting your Zacians to stick around in the game, which could be pretty reasonable. Notably, I'm not playing any Turbo Patch. I don't think they're necessarily that good when you're already playing double Oranguru to try and make your Intrepid Swords work very quickly in the game. Also, you got Acrobike Synergy, try and make your Sources pop off quite quickly. So, and especially because Mawile is also just a 2-energy attacker in the deck now as well. I feel like you don't necessarily need those coin flips, and ultimately I don't know what you'd be cutting for those coin flips outside of support accounts, or reducing your Jirachi Prism Star package, which might also be worthwhile as well, seeing as though there are more 3-prize Pokemon coming into the game with all the VMAX decks. So that could be reasonable, but for the most part we've seen that the thicker Jirachi Prism package has just been paying dividends for the most part, so that's why we've gone down this route. You could look into playing Cobalion GX if you are concerned about Control playing the Sleep package, or if you're even thinking about Vikavolt playing the Sleep package as well, which could be interesting. Crobat V could give you some extra burst draw, especially important when you are digging for sources in that sort of mid to late game for your second Zacian for the most part. Tapu Fini again, trying to help that Blounce matchup out. I do think it's naturally pretty poor. And there's a few other builds you can try and work towards. Frying Pans again can help out against Blounce. Goggles can help out against Dragapult and a few other things here and there. Air Balloon could be something that you could, establish before item lock, and it could help you move between your Zacians, so you're less reliant on Bird Keepers. But I think again, without Guzhala, it's just kind of trying to randomly time it well is pretty difficult. Currently, we're not playing any stadium removal, and that could prove to be difficult, especially with Black Market Prism Star being sometimes included into Eternatus, more often than not, I would say, in Eternatus, and we saw how much of a pain that could be for Spiritomb players. So Chaotic Swell in the list could be an easy include, as could Viridian Forest, to give yourself, outs to counter stadiums and give yourself extra discard in the case of Viridian. For those sources as well that could pop off, and just making sure that you have extra attachments throughout the game. Again, if you are being item locked, you're not being able to cycle your deck quite as much as you would like, so having Viridian just sat there on board giving you some extra value is always pretty reasonable. But yeah, very straightforward turbozation for the most part. And then the Luke Metal list isn't too different either. This list is playing a Duraludon. Notably, the turbozation is not playing Duraludon. It's basically taking the scoop to Decidueye. But I think with the Frying Pan Luke Metal Full Metal Wall combo, one copy will win you that matchup. So I've made the one space commitment to win that matchup instead. I'm sticking to the Morwile and the Zamazenta. I think they're just very valuable against Eternatus, and I do think that will be a popular deck. I'm also adding in a couple Turbo Patch to this list exactly, where it wasn't in the previous list. It's because you're more often having to build extra attackers in this list because, the virtue of Jirachi Prism means that you are trying to shorten the game and shorten the amount of attackers required. So having a couple Turbo Patch in here to help yourself get more attackers is pretty reasonable. I do have a Tag Call package, notably no Guzmahala in here. Instead, I'm going for a Belelba and Bryson Man. Again, just more text for Eternatus. We've got Zamazenta that could be full metal walled. We've got a Belelba. They are going to struggle against that, especially if they're not playing ordinary rods. So that could be a real problem. Potentially I'm overteching for Eternatus in this list. You could try and add in some other stuff. At the moment, I have double Malolana as well, and when you full metal walled, you have double Malolana. I think you're naturally pretty decent against Vikavolt. It just depends how well you draw off the Marnies for the most part, to be honest. Outside of that, I think this deck is really solid. I think it's just a dodge fire deck, really. I think if you can take a calculated risk, people could go pretty far with a Luke Metal build of Zacian. I think it's very, very reasonable. A few other things you could consider. Second copy of Luke Metal, obviously, is reasonable. You could go down the Viridian route your own end to have more accessibility to sources and patches. I'm currently not playing any Dedenne or Crobat or Eldegoss because I don't want those easy prizes sat on the board, but the Morwile could potentially be a flexible spot. That's the one that's kind of just sat there at the moment, trying to help out even more against a matchup and give yourself a 2-energy attacker, but it's kind of the sort of odd one out at the moment, being such low hit points that it could be punished. You could work in Absol as well for extra disruption. A lot of things you could still do with this sort of list. So there's still experimentation to be had with Luke Metal Hammers, but I naturally think that this has a lot of good matchups on paper for me. In at number 5, we have Eternatus, the community's second place ranked deck. I'm putting it a little bit lower, and mostly because, although you are an excellent beat stick in the format with ridiculous hit points, you're still a stage 1 3-prize Pokemon that can, be up-traded against, to be honest, by Blacephalon. I think Zacian can also, definitely Turbo Zacian, they can try and gust and knock out Eternatus that you're trying to build up on the bench. They can get one Jirachi Prism Star activation to take a 3-prize knockout on Crobats. They could get double activation and double gust, which is, obviously a complete high roll, but it's possible. ADP lists as well, I think that's only a close matchup because of the Giant Bomb for one thing in my specific list, forcing Eternatus to get a very, very wide board as well as Gust, as well as find their stage 1. It's a lot of pieces, even with that Crobat draw that they can go for. So I think against the Zacian matchups, it's only okay. I think it's got a relatively weak control matchup as well. And you naturally don't have many good answers to Decidueye, so I do think there are still definite headaches for Eternatus. Where this guy does shine, though, is when you're just trying to be pretty honest against each other, when you're just coming up against easy other 3 prizes. You're going to body Dragapult, you're going to have a very decent PikaRom and Centiskorch matchup, that's for sure. I think your natural freedom of movement with high darkness energies helps out a lot against Vikavolt as well. Your natural high hit points helps out a lot against Vikavolt, really makes them draw well. So I think naturally Eternatus is still going to be pretty good at this tournament. I don't think it's going to be quite as good as it is in the next format, because I think Blacephalon basically draws a lot better in this format, and there's a lot more reason to play Blacephalon in this format than post-rotation, in my opinion. And I also think, most other decks have better comeback potential in this format than they do in the following one, because Marnie is such a stronger card next format. When you can't escape board a Jirachi. It's literally that simple. That makes me think Eternatus goes way over the top next set, to be honest. So I've actually got two lists of Eternatus to show off. The first is going to be a pretty straight Eternatus that does have that Yveltal GX package in its own list. Again, you're already like very, very good at trading against VMAX and VDEX, but the Yveltal can skew that prize trade in your favor if you want to. I've also got, 10 switch outs turn 1 with scoop up nets on anything that's a one prizer, air balloons, and those 4 high darkness energy. Hopefully meaning that you can get in there with your Alolan Meowth very early to spoil the fun, and this is going to take out Jirachis early on. So really trying to punish those Stellar Wish-based engines, of which there are plenty. Obviously very good against Baby Blounds as well. If you can get the knockout on a Jirachi early against Baby Blounds, it can really be a detriment to them, especially with Marnie combinations as well being worked in. So I think that's very decent. Absol as well to disrupt Jirachi engines. I think you've got a lot of hate here for Jirachi, which is very cool. You don't really have many answers to Decidueye with this list, something to bear in mind. 2 Hooper will not see you through. Yveltal GX can knock out a Decidueye because it's not stopping effects, it's only stopping damage, so something to bear in mind. But I do think you'll probably run out of resources against Deci, so something to consider. Other than that, pretty straightforward, streamlined Eternatus list. There are a few other things you could add in. Sableye V could certainly help out against Zamazenta. At the moment, I'm hoping that Yveltal GX does the job against it, but it could potentially not be good enough for you, especially if they are adding in Metal Goggles, which would be a super spicy tech, I think, for the deck. Alolan Persian GX as well. If we're already playing Meowth for the scams of spoiling the fun, you can try and scam Blounds by having the Alolan Persian in the deck, trying to keep your bench limited and give them not many attacking options against you. Yes, they do often play things like Cramorant and a few other non-Ultra Beast attackers, but this Persian could still get over the line if it's, built around enough, so something to consider. Outside of that, I'm only playing one stadium. You may want to work in Viridians for extra energy options, because we are only doing 1 manual attachment a turn with this sort of list, so getting more access to those so you don't miss a beat is going to be important. Weak Guard could help out if there are any fighting decks that you consider. I have none in my top 10. I don't think they're good enough, but if you're expecting to get countered, Weak Guard could be a card that you could consider. Piers is quite good if you're expecting Vikavolt, of course, because you can continue to search your Pokemon even when your items are shut off. Outside of that, everything's pretty normal. Switches could be included instead of air balloons if you're worried about Raichu doing paralysis plays. That's one slightly greedy thing about this list. It's not playing Switch, but the air balloons are insta plays, so that's kind of why I wanted them. Really does depend on how much Raichu you're expecting in the tournament. The other list is a Weavile base list. It's got 1 copy of the GX, 1 copy of Evil Admonition. Evil Admonition, crazy in Mirror, obviously, because of the amount of abilities that come down on the board. Weavile, as well, being a 1 energy attacker, is very good against the control matchups, especially when you have Darkrai Prism Star Scoop Up Net combo. You can see as well, I've already got the Ordinary Rod in here as well for extra recycle against control. So hopefully this Weavile being able to, move your energies around, Darkrai being able to pick it up and put it down for extra acceleration, should be able to outrun some Hammers, which I think is reasonable, especially if Hammers are working their way into just random decks in general. I've still got a pretty high Switch, Scoop Up Net, and hide energy count, so you can try and weave in that lower Meowth as well, which is pretty decent. So yeah, this is basically just a more hammer-proof list than the previous one. You don't have the real big high roll of Yveltal GX, but you are a bit more robust against the controlling stuff, so something to think about if you do want to have that. Also, I think we naturally have slightly better Decidueye answers when you can attack with Darkrai Prism Star and Weavile, and we have Ordinary Rod to recover the Weavile, so maybe you have a slightly better matchup there as well if you're expecting that to be big. Overall, though, pretty much the same core concept as before. You could add in some of the tech cards from the previous slide if you want to, like Absol. That's really up to you. In at number 4, I have Blacephalon. Community pretty much in line here as well, expecting it to be a popular and strong deck in the format. It doesn't really gain much from this set at all, to be honest, and that's not necessarily important because it just gets into a better meta spot, in my opinion. With Centiskorch and Eternatus both coming out in this set, not really having any answer, and Decidueye even, not really having any answer to Baby Blounds just means that you're pretty much going to be able to roll them if you want to. Now, I think Control's in a really, really good spot in this format, and I also think Vikavolt is going to be solid, but these are really the only things keeping the Blacephalon floodgates at bay, in my opinion. So, yeah, I've got a lot of respect for Blounds in terms of its meta placement. I don't have a lot of respect for it in terms of how it draws, but that's not stopped people playing Blounds before. It's not stopped it being one of the top tier decks of Rebel Clash, and I do think that will continue. One thing I will say is that ADP does potentially become a lot more difficult now because they have more high roll potential with turbo patches, and my lists are getting more gusty as well, so they can get around the one prize Blound more and try and just ignore the Blound and try and race you a lot quicker as well. So if there are going to be sort of turbo patch high roll builds, I know later on in the Rebel Clash format it became sort of autopad high roll builds that were trying to combat the Blacephalon by GXing straight away, forcing the opponent to hit 300 turn 2 with the Blacephalon. Not always the easiest, especially when they weren't able to support a turn 1 sometimes. So yeah, I think the ADP matchup does get a little bit difficult. I was close to putting it into the close matchup, but I kept it as favorable for Blound because it's really the ADP that has to high roll more than the Blound's player to be able to win that matchup. But something I thought I'd mention, I can imagine a lot more ADPs are going more aggro in the next set, and that will make Blacephalon sort of rush to be able to keep up with them. My list, though, like I said, really isn't too unchanged. I think there's a couple of cute things going on here. I've got a Stadium Nav 3 Stadium split going on, really just because I want to have that Giant Hearth in the deck, so you can actually have some extra outs from Stellar Wish to get energies against item lock. So that's really the only kind of like mini change that I've got going on here. I've also added a Victini V, kind of the same deal. It's a decent attacker against Vikavolt, even if you've got nothing else going on in your hand. It can accelerate to itself, or you can well draw into it, either or, and you can do, you know, a decent 2-shot against Vikavolt for the most part. So that's really all I've done to a pretty straightforward Blacephalon list. There's a ton of other options that you could be considering. If you're more worried about Vikavolt, you could add in even more attackers. Double has a natural reduction of damage going into it and has, again, just decent base output against them. Heat Transiex can do a good chunk into them and is just generally decent at knocking out one prize stuff in the early game without committing towards that Fireball Circus. Crobat V could give you extra burst draw if you really want to, which could be decent. Galarian Zigzagoon still a decent mirror tech card, still decent at maybe even picking off Crobats in the late game if you are adding in more scoop up nets to accommodate the Zigzagoon. Finny for mirror if you're expecting this to still be popular. Mew if you're still worried about PikaRom, that's one kind of like greedy cut that I have made. Mewtwo as well for extra options to Welder. Right now I've only got the one Eldegoss, so you might want the Mewtwo or the Palpad in addition to all of that stuff. And then it's really just the other packages that we've seen in here in the past. Adventure Bag for Beastspringer / Lucky Egg if you're expecting those to be helpful enough cards. Great Catcher / Bosch for extra gusting if you really want to. And Lily's Pokédoll as well. At the moment I'm not playing, well, I'm trying to limit as many items as possible for the most part. But a lot of these decks are still playing pretty high item counts, just something to be aware of. Vikavolt is going to be very strong in this format, no matter what deck you're playing, I would say. In number 3, we have control builds. I've lumped these all together because there are just so many to sort of credit, I guess you could say. The community rated the Cincino build in 9th place and the other builds substantially lower, so something I just wanted to mention. But Oranguru, in general, you know, still in this format, of course, and it's going to be strong. I do think you have some decent auto wins. I think one of the best foils to Blounds already is just a real reason that people will look towards control, because it's one of the only checks to that deck in the format, I would say. Decidueye is a nice, easy win that you can pick up. Eternatus is probably favored, even if they are playing energy acceleration stuff, because they have so many things you can try and trap. They have so many things that are multiple energy attackers, and at the end of the day, you'll still Belelbring a bunch of stuff away. You can also Belelbring their board away quite a lot to make them get more Pokemon and make them draw cards naturally. And when they're forced to draw more cards, you know, they're doing the job for you, which could also be very cool. Don't forget that you can always use that secondary effect of Belelbring against them. It will definitely be pretty versatile and strong. I think Centiskorch should be pretty routine unless they're playing Ninetales. Zacian matchups I think are also pretty good as long as they're not playing that ADP. I do think ADP gets slightly worse because, again, they have more opportunities to, you know, turbo patch their way to sort of combat your own coin flip hammers or your Yell Grunts, so that could be a bit of a headache for you. Vikavolt I also think is pretty difficult. They're shutting off some of your most important cards. It makes you go more heavily focused down the supporter route, and that's why we're going to be looking at some of the Japanese 60s now to see what they've done to control. Personally, I haven't played enough control in this format to give you my real opinion, so we're just going to be looking towards the successful Japanese lists. Apologies, guys, I've tried to do a lot of deck lists here, but control is just not my wheelhouse, so I'm way more comfortable showing you someone else's successful list than one of my own creations, or, you know, just putting it in the format for myself, but basically the same 60 that these lists have been. This is the Delcatty build, which is trying to give yourself extra access to supporter cards. I think it's really important to be able to do this, especially against that Vikavolt matchup. You can get back your own channelers that you can see here that can reactivate your item cards, which is interesting. But in general, it's just getting you more access when you're not able to use Power Pad under item lock. So the Delcat is your sort of workaround there, which could be pretty interesting. Other than that, it does have the Articuno for extra controlling options and a very, very high count of Yell Grunt. You can see that they really are trying to, surge double Yell Grunt a lot of the time, especially with Delcatty. That's actually quite possible. Or, Surge, Faber, Yell Grunt. Those sorts of combos, I think, is what this list is specifically built around. And you're looping the Crushing Hammers more than anything, because you're not playing the dolls in this list at all. You're just saying, item lock stops doll, let's not deal with those. Instead, let's just go full energy removal instead, which is certainly an interesting route. Outside of that, not too much else. I could consider potentially an APOM one-of to have some extra hand destruction, which could be cool, / Persian as an option. I'm pretty surprised there's no Ditto Prism Star in this 60, seeing as though you're already playing 2-stage 1, so I think that's a natural just include that I would put in immediately. Outside of that, I think you could try and work in tag calls, but you can just see from this list that this player was so conscious of control and of Vikavolt specifically, that he has gone as many supporters as possible for every option that he needs. So yeah, it's just pretty obvious that this list is going to function quite well against the Vikavolt just based on how it's built. So that's certainly a big reason why I wanted to show off this list specifically, because it will perform better against Vikavolt than most of the other control decks, in my opinion. We also have this really cool Dragonite base build as well from Japan. Trying to use the Speed Energy Mareep combo to be a mini draw engine in those early turns, which could be pretty cool. Not playing any Cincinnos notably, but this one is much more similar to what we know. Trying to use those Lily's Poké Dolls as well as Slumbering Forest combo with Mareep. Obviously, if you can catch a Vikavolt napping, you can put down your item guards, which is pretty sweet. And that's how they're trying to get around the Vikavolt matchup, while still having, Mewtwo and Magcargo to discard a bunch of cards. This list, as you can see, is much less focused on removing your opponent's stuff and just trying to deal with their deck as quickly as possible. The Lance Prism Star is a pretty interesting package. You can see it's got the other Oranguru, the Sword and Shield Oranguru, in the list, so you can put your Dragonites that you draw into back on top of your deck, so you can Lance at the right time, which I think is really cute as well. I thought about adding in Pokemon Communication for a similar role and giving yourself extra access to Pokemon, but with those 4 Capture Energies, I think you've got a really decent chance of hitting a lot of Pokemon in the early turns anyway. So yeah, I think, again, this is just a fairly well-rounded list, not having to focus on Ball Search towards Cinccino this time to give yourself a better chance against Vikavolt. I think both of these lists are specifically built to have better Vikavolt matchups, and we've seen how strong Slumbering combo has been in Control anyway. That both these lists, I think, have a decent shot in the new format. So yeah, I really do think these Japanese lists pave the way for Control in the Pog format. In number 2, we have Vikavolt, the community's #1 pick for the tournaments. I do agree that Vikavolt is going to be very strong. I just feel like you can lock your way out of basically any bad matchup. Sometimes you're just paralyzing Bolt and Marnie someone and they just have to pass straight into you, and you can just completely roll people at times. I saw it countless times with Seismitoad that people just weren't able to do anything, and it's going to get really easy for the Vikavolt player. But one thing I will say about Vikavolt in this format, comparing it to post-rotation format, is you're actually much more of a tempo deck than you would imagine. I'd actually say that this is more similar to playing something like Aquabox than it was Toad Tina, because Aquabox specifically used Quaking Punch to slow down the tempo of a lot of decks. Yes, he'd Quaking Punch through the game against certain matchups, and so will Vikavolt, but for the most part, you're just trying to slow your opponent down long enough for you to get ahead in the prize race, or just deal with a threat or two on their board, to the point where you're ahead, and you can just start going aggro from then on. You can go into Super Zap Cannon, you can go into your Raichu, and pummel the last few prizes out of your opponent. So I really do think that this deck is much more tempo-based and less control-based. You'll see from the successful Japanese list as well that was very much the case. They're trying to use Giant Bombs, they're trying to use E-Powers to be a very aggressive Lightning deck and trying to just let your opponent hit you, you'll hit them back, you're trying to trade on each other a lot of the time, and that's something that I think gets kind of lost with this list. A lot of people think this is more control-y, and people are going down hammer routes and, adding in potentially even their own Slumbering Forest Mareep combo, and I think those could be successful, but I think for the most part, play this as if it's the new sort of Aquabox of old with Seismitoad and a handful of other tech attackers, This time, the Vikavolt is the next backup attacker for the most part. But yeah, I feel like it's kind of a tempo deck in this format, and I really do think it's very decent. I think its matchup spread is all very close. I would never say that anything has a very favorable matchup against Vikavolt. Even something like Decidueye that naturally just walls out almost the entire deck. I feel like paralyzing, choosing to go second, getting a turn 1 paralyzing bolt with an E-power, knocking out a Rowlet or knocking out their Jirachi just puts them way on the back foot, and they can lose like just on the spot because of that sort of stuff. Especially, I think Vikavolt is great going second, by the way. I think it's similar to playing like Centiskorch, where you will choose to go second with Vikavolt as much as possible because you have a very, very high odds of still getting that turn 1 paralyzing bolt. And if you're stopping your opponent playing a supporter turn 1 and then items for, the next like 2 or 3 turns, they are going to be drawing suboptimally, let's be honest. So I think any matchup can sort of be patched up by the fact that you're limiting your opponent from, sometimes a third of their deck, for example. So, yeah, Vikavolt going to be very, very strong. I'm expecting it to be pretty popular as long as people get their hands on these Vikavolts. I really do think it's one of the strongest archetypes, not too different from the Japanese 60s that we saw come first and second in their own format. You can see I've gone more focused on the bombs. I cut the counter gain and I cut the toughness cape. So we've just got more bombs, slightly more streamlined. The only other thing I've done really is I've added in a couple more tech supporter cards. I've added in a Bird Keeper to go alongside our Malolana so that we can get out of status from Sleepy Mill and against potentially Sleepy Vikavolt if they are going for a mirror match sort of situation. I actually thought about adding in Mareep Sleep. Even just a one-off Mareep alongside your escape boards could be a decent mirror tech so that they're not able to item lock and you can. Because then you're able to, E-power over the top of them, which can be really, really strong. So, yeah, ultimately, I've got a few extra outs to sleep package, basically, so that your lock can be maintained. I've also added in a Koga's Trap as my option to try and stop a Vikavolt from hitting into you, which could be, again, very, very cool. Vikavolt has a natural 3 retreat cost. You also play Absol, so if there's a 2-energy Vikavolt on your opponent's side and you have Absol and Koga's Trap them, and also item lock them, it's going to cause them a real headache unless they're playing Zero or a GX, which most standard lists won't. So, yeah, Koga's Trap seems like a very, very nasty tech card. And in times, it can also just help things tick over damage-wise, so that it could get knocked out coming into your turn. Especially when you have so many different modifiers that you can do with E-powers, you can actually get quite cute with the Koga's Trap as well, which I think could also be like very, very cool to try out. So yeah, pretty techie list. There was a point where I had a second Sinlin in the 60 as well, to try and incorporate this extra Bird Keeper, the one of Erica, to help out against Eternatus and Koga's Trap. So those are all things to bear in mind. One other tech card I would actually, or I should actually have put on here was that you can, of course, play your own Belelba. I think I would only do that if I was also playing Cape of Toughness to put yourself out of range of Eternatus, potentially, especially if you are using Paralyzing Bolt. So I think it's kind of a 2-card package. You add in the Toughness Cape, you add in the Belelba, to try and be awkward for those Eternatus players and put their damage output a little bit down. At the moment, I'm just playing the Giant Bombs and maybe even a Koga's Trap in the mix to make life difficult for those opponents, though. In at number 1, I've put ADP-Zacian. I think it was kind of a safe pick, and I think that's basically what I think ADP is for the tournament. I think there's no real matchup that you're going to go into and be like, damn, I actually can't win here. I actually think ADP is okay against basically everything. If you want to tech for Decidueye with your Duraludon, you should be very, very solid there. You've naturally been decent against control this entire time, especially with E-switch builds. Blacephalon, yes, is a pretty bad matchup, but you can try and tech things, like your Absols, your Marnies, your Frying Pans if you really want to, your Tapu Finis even. Those are things that you can tech for relatively simply. I think actually your worst matchup is just non-ADP-Zacians for the most part, because they just have more tempo against you, and the Loot Metal build is going to have Energy Destruction, which I think is sometimes a problem. Other than that, I think you've got a ton of close matchups. The good thing about having close matchups as ADP is you have Intrepid Sword, and that means that you're going to brick less than your opponent a lot of the time, and you have high roll potential. You have high roll of hitting your auto creation on turn 1 if you're playing E-switch shenanigans. You have high roll potential of hitting, like 1 or 2 energy off Intrepid Sword, and you're already set for the game in terms of attackers. So you have a couple high roll opportunities which other decks just don't have. You have an inbuilt draw engine, so against Vikavolt, you're at least drawing cards. Against control, you have natural auto creation, which helps, you know, beat out a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, I still just think ADP's auto creation gives you a really, really balanced matchup spread that just means you can beat anything. So yeah, I think the deck is still just very solid, and going into a relatively unknown meta, I think it's still a very safe play. The first list I'm going to show is going to be an energy switch list. It is also playing the tackle package, and you know what that means. One copy of Giant Bomb is sneaking into my ADP. I do think, again, it's a great way to put Eternatus down in hit points to a range where you can just Brave Blade it out the gate. I'm once again also playing Scamazenta and Morwild GX. Playing the Duraludon, again, if it's a one-card include that can beat out this annoying deck, I think you may as well add it. Metal Sharpener as well can be a little prod into things as well if you really want to, if you just happen to lead him or something, because you can still accelerate to one of your guys, your own ADP, for example, as well, whilst also getting a bit of chip damage in, so that's never the worst. Also, you can always, you know, energy switch off Duraludon later as well. At the moment, I'm just playing the one copy of Celtic Swell. If you want to go down like Viridian route and just have basic energies, that could also be an option. If you want to thicken the Guzhala line, if you want to add more bombs to the deck, you could also go for that route. At the moment, I'm just playing like a tech bomb, basically, because I'm only expecting a handful of Eternatus, and I'm still more worried about Vikavolt. So you can see that's why there's a Birdkeeper and a Malolana in here as well, to give yourself options of healing against their stuff and moving in and out of your Brave Blade to still get, you know, chains of attacks going, which is still going to be important for sure. Other than that, once again, relatively straightforward. ADP-Zacian, there's a ton of tech Pokemon you can try and add. Again, trying to improve that Blounce matchup, probably one of your worst matchups. That can be done through Absol, Finny, adding in more reset stamps, more Marnies in the opening turns. That sort of stuff could be reasonable. If you want to add in Turbo Patches, you potentially have even more high roll potential for your Ultra Creation GX. Bear in mind, it's a coin flip card, and I'm kind of against that in this deck, especially when you have such good acceleration through Saucer anyway. I think Saucer E-Switch is always like going to be better than the Turbo Patch. It's just having more potential copies, basically. But at the moment, I would prefer to keep the consistency card of like Oranguru in general, because it's more than just getting you extra Intrepid Sword value. It's getting you all sorts of value throughout the entire game. So that's why I've not gone for it. But if you want to tech more for Blounce and equal up that bad matchup, I think you're basically decent against everything in the format. And yeah, that's just ADP for you, basically. The other build I've got is kind of more high rolly. It is playing some coin flips. It's playing Pokemon catchers. Instead of having the Giant Bomb to try and patch up that awkward matchup, you're in Eternatus, I should say, and against Centiskorch to a certain extent. Instead, you're trying to just alter creation and say, well, for the rest of the game, I'm just ignoring your big guy, and I'm just trying to hit your bats, your Dedenes, because Centiskorch and Eternatus are both heavily focused on those cards. So just going for the old ignore strategy and just trying to target their bench guys is always an option for you. So that's why you're seeing 3 boss as well as 3 Pokemon catchers, just to be like, well, I've GX'd, and now I'm going to ignore everything and just try and swing at you with my Zacians and my Morwilds and hope that that's going to be enough. Again, when you're playing ADP, I think Duraludon's just an easy one-of include to save yourself a bit of headache against Decidueye as a potential problem. Other than that, again, straightforward. We're playing Viridians instead of Spinner Bike. I know a lot of people have been pro Spinner Bike. I do think the Pokemon catchers eat up a lot of space, but if you do want to go down Spinner Bike route, you could go there for sure. Again, you can add in more defensive stuff if you're worried about Baby Blown. Again, the list that I've shown you, the 2 ADP-Zacians right now that I've shown you don't have the best Baby Blown matchup, but you can play more defensive stuff if you really want to. And this list is also pretty light on the old Birdkeeper / Malolana front, and if you want to have a better way to chain attackers against Vikavolt specifically, you're probably going to want to look at adding in a few of those copies as well, so that could be something gone missing really in this list that you could experiment with. Other than that, pretty straightforward 60. Outside the top 10 then, here are some of the picks that have really caught my eye. Ultimate Mewtwo has been doing pretty well on some sort of side tournaments right now, and obviously Henry had a big performance in it with Rebel Clash. The community didn't really care too much about this archetype, and I think it's kind of correct to not care about it too much when the format is so blind. But that said, we've seen things like Marshchamp do well in the deck already for like the PikaRom matchup. That could be done again to help out Eternatus. You can naturally play ADP for the control matchups. So really, I think just on paper, especially with Dragapult going down in play, there might be a small niche for Mewtwo The main reason it didn't actually make my top 10 was because I don't know how the hell I need to tell you guys to build this, because it's completely meta-reliant on what you're expecting. So it is a huge risk. You could just not be playing the right attackers for the tournament based on what you run into. So you really have to be confident that your metagame is correct if you are going for an Ultimate Mewtwo build, or you play some more general attackers that are good and just hope that those general attacks are going to be useful. Spiritomb Beasts with that sort of Yveltal package was decent. I think it was mostly trying to target Dragapult as an archetype in the format, and although we do gain some extra potential damage burst in Spikemuth, and just, more synergy with Jinx and Hooper potentially as an early game attacker, I do think, again, it's not like specifically really, really well placed. I also think Eternatus naturally coming in with potentially 4 Zigzagoon, 4 Scoop Up Net could be a bit of a headache for you. Makes you play a bit defensively against them for the most part. So I also think Spiritomb's like not ideal against control. You can be okay, but I don't think it's like the best matchup for you, especially if you're only playing like 10 energies or something. You can get run out quite easily. So yeah, I think Spiritomb, again, it was kind of built for a different meta. So if you want to continue trying it, by all means. One thing I thought was really interesting was Toxtricity was, kind of a flop in Rebel Clash, but it does get a bit more streamlined with Glarow and Slowbro V as an option in the deck. And Gmax Riot still does a really, really good chunk, and this is the only time you can try and use it alongside E-Power. So this could be like the low-key sleeper beat stick deck. It's Eternatus, basically, in terms of its damage output, but you also have Vikavolt as an option. So that sounded appealing to me. You have Vikavolt to try and help out the Eternatus matchup. You have Toxtricity as your beat stick. Could be pretty interesting. Who knows? If someone has put time into Toxtricity, good luck to you. I think it's a cool option if you can get it to run. Another thing that I think is decent that I actually forgot to put on my poll, so it got no votes technically, is going to be Frostmoth. Frostmoth was basically petrified this entire time of PikaRom, petrified of Dragapult as well, because they can knock out your Snom so easily. I think with both those archetypes potentially going down in play, there may be this niche Frostmoth box deck that can do relatively well. Blastoise Piplup is very good at reducing damage against Vikavolt. It basically laughs at their damage output and stops them from item locking you. Basically, they have to just play a different game plan, otherwise they're going to lose. I think Keldeo GX is very solid of a GX attack against Eternatus, and adding in some other attackers to try and keep up with them, maybe some one prize stuff, could be reasonable. I think you're already relatively okay against the controlling decks. If you are using Volk Prism to play around Lily's Pokedolls for the most part, that stuff can get pretty reasonable. So I think Frostmoth, there's something there. Again, it's kind of what sort of toolbox of attackers you want to work in, and you have to accept that you probably won't be the most consistent deck in the room, and you're still worried if people are sticking with old faithful PikaRom or Dragapult, but there could be a nice niche for that deck. So again, interesting if people have put the time in towards it, for sure. Phalanx is the meme that people are just saying, well, I'm fighting. I guess I'm good against Eternatus, and I'm good against, Vikavolt. But yeah, I think you're pretty bad against the rest of the field. So I put it on here just to appease those fighting players, but I really think it's a poor play. It's too narrow of a play for me, especially when I think Control and ADP will be, as big as Eternatus and Vikavolt, in my eyes at least. A lot of people are still backing Welderbox. It does do well in sort of unknown formats because it is so streamlined. You naturally have Ninetales, which is pretty good against Control as well. So I kind of tip my cap to Welderbox, but I think it's kind of outpowered by the Centiskorches. It's kind of outpowered by the Eternatus players. It's outpowered by a lot of things. Even Baby Blounds can be relatively favorable. I don't think you're naturally all the best against PikaRom either. I think that matchup has got worse with Vikavolt coming out. So I think there's a lot to be desired for the Welderbox deck. There are a few inherent strengths there, but I do think, again, you're not the most consistent. You have to work so much harder for KOs than most other decks. So, yeah, it leaves a lot to be desired for me. I couldn't really put it in my top 10 on good conscience. Obstagoon could be also an option. Obviously, you gain Turbo Patch now, so potentially Sableye is more of an attacking threat. Obviously, Obstruct is still decent against some of the kind of relics of the format, if any of those stick around. Obstruct's still good against ADP, for example, and a few other decks here and there. But as more and more VMAXs come out, you have to kind of go into the shadows and hope that you're just damage buff towards Yveltal and Sableye and that sort of thing. So I'm sure there will be a couple of people playing Obstagoon because it is still a kind of easy wall that can take easy wins. But I don't think it's necessarily as good as Decidueye particularly. And I think you could, again, just be playing more consistent decks. Finally, there's Rillaboom Eggrow. I think it's kind of just an average deck. I don't think it's good enough. It was kind of specifically decent for a meta where you could out-heal PikaRom and out-heal Dragapult, and I think you're coming into this meta where there's a lot more one-hit KO with Eternatus and with Centiskorch. I think you've got to be another like real dodge and weave deck. There's a few things I do like. Again, you can play Snivysaur if you want to help out that control matchup. You can do a few things here and there, so there are some plays you can make with Rillaboom to have a decent matchup spread, but I do think your tanking opportunities just get way worse in general. So I, again, had to leave it out of the top 10, but there's some plays you can make for sure. So that's it from me, guys. I've spoken a lot. I've tried to talk quickly and concisely. I'm sure there's things I've missed, though, so get it all down in the comments below. This, again, I will reiterate, it's a format that I haven't played a huge amount of. It's a lot of theory has gone into this, rather than a lot of hours of playtesting, because I've mostly been playing post-rotation. So although I have seen Eternatus in action, Centiskorch in action, Vikavolt in action, they are very different animals in the Pog format. So take the top 10 with a pinch of salt. Let me know yours down below. What tech cards should I be playing in some of these decks? What have I completely missed? Am I correct to be adding in, or to not be adding in Turbo Patch, or should it be going into every single deck? I'll hear it all down below. Myself and Jack are actually going to be commentating, or helping out commentate at least, the stream. It's going to be happening on the 22nd and 23rd. You can go ahead and check out the Facebook page. If you literally just type in Pog2020 onto the Facebook page, you'll be able to find the championships pretty quickly, and then you can find your way to sign up for the event. So that is, open to you if you really want to. Anyone can enter. It's free to enter. So by all means, head on in there and join the fun. If it was down to us, me and Jack, we rated ADP the highest deck, and it's also a deck that we've had a lot of experience with, and it doesn't change too much in the new format. So if we were both playing, it would have been what we picked up, because, again, it's something that we're both quite familiar with, and we believe it's one of the strongest decks in the format anyway. So kind of a win-win, really, all around for ADP. Let me know what you guys think is going to be the best deck. What are you going to be rocking? What have you tested with? What's going to be overhyped, what's going to be under the radar? I'd love to hear it all down below. Let's get the discussion going. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.